The Germans never expected HVAP rounds to make 76mm Shermans into Panther-killers, transforming the battlefield equation overnight. Their technological superiority suddenly faced an unexpected challenge that would alter the course of armored warfare on the Western Front. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. September 19th, 1944. The fields surrounding Ericourt in Lorraine had disappeared beneath a fog so thick you could scoop it with a spoon. First Lieutenant Merwin Menn sat hunched in the commander's hatch of his Sherman tank, the 76mm gun pointing blindly into the gray void. The damp had worked its way through his uniform, settling deep in his bones, a constant companion these past weeks. "Visibility shot to hell, sir," whispered Sergeant Francis Baker from below, his gunner's steady hands resting on controls that felt increasingly useless in this soup. Merwin nodded silently. His mind kept returning to their last engagement near Luneville, the distinctive crack of Panther shells, the screams over the radio as 3 tanks from his platoon erupted in flames. The Germans called their Panthers invincible, and so far, the lieutenant had seen little evidence to the contrary. Around him, the men of the 37th Tank Battalion performed their pre-combat rituals with muted efficiency. No one spoke above a whisper. The fog muffled everything except the distant, ominous rumble of engines. German tanks on the move, their exact position impossible to pinpoint. "Radio check," Merwin ordered, his voice barely audible over the Sherman's idling engine. Each crew member responded in turn, their words clipped, professional. But the commander could hear the underlying tension. These men had seen too many of their comrades die in burning metal coffins. Private Wilson, the loader, nervously drummed his fingers against the ammunition rack. "Think they know we're here, sir?" "If they don't yet, they will soon enough," Merwin replied, scanning the opaque whiteness for any hint of movement. The waiting was always the worst part. Captain Kenneth Lamison's voice crackled over the radio. "All units hold position. Intelligence reports at least 5 Panthers moving northeast toward your position. Engage only when you have confirmed visual." Merwin acknowledged the order, then turned to his driver. "Keep us behind this hedgerow. If we're lucky, they'll pass without seeing us." Luck had been in short supply lately. The American tankers had learned the hard way that their Shermans were outmatched by the German Panthers in almost every category: armor, range, firepower. The knowledge hung over the crew like a death sentence. Through a brief thinning in the fog, Merwin caught a glimpse of his platoon's other 4 tanks, positioned in a rough semicircle along the field's edge. Each commander stood similarly vigilant, faces etched with the same grim determination. The lieutenant pulled out his worn pocket watch, nearly 7 hours since they'd taken up position. His fingers traced the inscription on the back, a gift from his father, who'd fought in the previous war. "Movement, 2 o'clock, Baker suddenly hissed from below. Merwin tensed, peering into the swirling mist. For a moment, he thought he saw the distinctive angular silhouette of a panther's turret. Then it vanished like a predator retreating into tall grass. The day stretched before them, each second pregnant with possibility. Every man in the tank knew it. Today could be their last. Sergeant Francis Baker ran his fingers over the unfamiliar ammunition, his weathered hands tracing the contours of what might be their salvation. 6 shells, nestled among their standard AP rounds, stood out with an almost ethereal quality. The markings read M93 HVAP, high-velocity armor-piercing, but it was their distinctive silvery tungsten tips that caught his eye, gleaming defiantly even in the dim light of dawn. "What do you make of these?" Baker asked, glancing up at First Lieutenant Merwin Menn, who was hunched over a tattered map in their Sherman's cramped interior. Merwin abandoned his strategic planning and leaned closer to examine the shells. "Those weren't in our last resupply." The previous night, Lieutenant Daniel Roebuck had appeared like a phantom at their position, mud-splattered and exhausted from his journey from the Colorado Ordnance Depot. The supply officer had personally delivered the small wooden crate, his eyes darting nervously as if carrying state secrets. "Detroit's miracle," Roebuck had whispered, his voice barely audible over the distant artillery. "Tungsten core. Smaller diameter, higher velocity. They'll punch through a panther's hide at the right range. He'd gripped Merwin's shoulder with unexpected intensity. Don't waste them. We've got precious few to go around. Now, in the cold light of morning, the crew gathered around to inspect their new weapon. Private James Wilson, their loader, whistled softly. "These little beauties are supposed to kill panthers?" he asked, skepticism evident in his voice. After months of watching standard rounds bounce harmlessly off German armor, hope felt dangerous. "That's what the lieutenant promised," Baker replied, carefully returning the shell to its wooden cradle. "Called them silver bullets." Corporal Thomas Reed, their driver, snorted. "We've heard miracle stories before. Remember those stabilizers that were supposed to let us fire accurately on the move?" The men fell silent, each remembering comrades lost to the superior German tanks. The Panther's 75mm gun could penetrate their Sherman from over 1,000 yards, while their own shells often proved useless unless fired at suicidally close range. Merwin studied his crew's faces, the cautious hope, the ingrained skepticism. They'd been through too much together to embrace false promises. "We'll test them when the time comes," he said finally. "For now, keep them secure and separate from the standard rounds. Baker, you'll need to adjust your aim points if what Roebuck says is true." The gunner nodded, already calculating new trajectories in his head. As fog continued to blanket the Lorraine countryside, the crew returned to their morning routines, checking equipment, cleaning weapons, brewing coffee in dented cups. But something had shifted. Each man stole glances at the wooden box containing the HVAP rounds, daring, just barely, to believe that these 6 shells might change everything. The silhouette materialized from the fog like a ghost, the unmistakable angular form of a Panther tank, its long-barreled 75mm gun sweeping the mist. First Lieutenant Merwin Men felt his mouth go dry as the German behemoth rolled forward, less than 300 yards away, and completely unaware of their presence. "Target, 2 o'clock, Merwin whispered, his voice barely audible over the idling engine. "Baker, load HVAP." Sergeant Francis Baker's hands moved with practiced precision, yet there was a new tension in his movements as he reached for one of the special rounds. The silvery-tipped shell felt different, heavier, more substantial somehow. The gunner slid it into the breech with reverent care. "HVAP loaded," Baker confirmed, pressing his eye to the sight. The Panther grew larger in his optics, its frontal armor angled in what had become a terrifying sight for American tankers across Europe. "Remember what Roebuck said," Merwin reminded him. "Aim for the mantlet, not the glacis." Baker made a minute adjustment, his breathing slowing as he focused on the small area where the gun joined the turret. The crew fell silent. Even their breathing seemed to pause. "On target," Baker murmured. "Fire." The Sherman shuddered as the 76mm gun roared, the report echoing across the fog-shrouded fields of Lorraine. The shell's trajectory was invisible, but its impact was anything but. There was a flash of sparks, then an explosion that rocked the Panther backward. To the astonishment of every man in Merwin's crew, the German tank's turret hatch blew open, followed by billowing black smoke and flames that cut through the mist. "Holy..." Private Jenkins, their loader, couldn't finish his sentence. "Did we just..." the driver began. "We got him," Merwin confirmed, his voice tight with disbelief. "Baker, you magnificent bastard, you got him." The radio crackled to life as nearby units reported the explosion. Merwin grabbed the handset. "Sherman, 76, just took out a Panther. Up close," he reported, unable to keep the excitement from his voice. The radio exploded with chatter, disbelief, questions, explanations. For months, the Panthers had been phantoms that appeared, killed, and disappeared. Now one burned before them, its crew scrambling from hatches, their uniforms ablaze. Baker sat back from his gunner's position, sweat beading on his forehead despite the autumn chill. "It worked," he said simply, looking at his hands as if they belonged to someone else. Merwin clapped his gunner's shoulder. "Detroit's miracle," he said, echoing Lieutenant Roebuck's words from days earlier. Through his viewport, he watched German crewmen surrender, hands raised, faces showing the same shock that surely mirrored his own. For the first time since facing the Panthers, the myth of their invulnerability lay in burning pieces before them. The news of a Panther taken down by a Sherman spread through the ranks like wildfire. Inside a weathered farmhouse that had seen better days before the war, Captain Kenneth Lamison hunched over a map-strewn table, his face illuminated by a single kerosene lamp that cast long shadows across the room. "One lucky shot doesn't change the war," the captain insisted to his gathered officers, though his hands betrayed him, trembling slightly around his chipped coffee mug. "We've all heard stories before, exaggerated battlefield reports." Lieutenant Colonel Harris from Battalion Intelligence pushed back. "3 separate radio operators confirmed it, sir. The 76 punched right through at less than 400 yards. Lamison ran a hand through his hair, leaving it standing at odd angles. "Even if it's true, these special rounds are in critically short supply. Detroit can't manufacture tungsten cores fast enough." The farmhouse creaked in the wind as rain began to patter against the windows. Outside, the fog continued to blanket the Lorraine countryside, shrouding both American and German positions in a ghostly white veil. Meanwhile, First Lieutenant Merwin and his crew had pulled back to a small grove for a brief respite. The men sat on their Sherman's hull, passing a canteen between them. No one spoke much. They were still processing what they had witnessed. Sergeant Baker cleaned his gunner's sight methodically, his movements precise but his mind elsewhere. "Never seen anything like it," he finally said, breaking the silence. "That Panther just opened up. Could be we just hit a weak spot." Merwin replied, though there was something new in his voice, a cautious optimism that had been absent for months. Private Wilson, their loader, chuckled nervously. "Whatever it was, I saw their commander bail out so fast he left his hat behind." The crew shared a brief laugh, the sound strange and almost forgotten. For months, they had operated with the grim certainty that encountering a Panther meant potential death. American tankers had developed a gallows humor about the superior German armor, calling their own Shermans Ronson lighters. They lit first time, every time. But now, something had changed. It wasn't jubilation or even confidence, just a small spark of possibility, where before there had been none. As evening approached, Merwin received orders to report to Captain Lamison. The commander wanted first-hand accounts, measurements, exact details of the engagement. The brass was skeptical, but interested. Back in their tank, the crew prepared for night watch. They had 5 HVAP rounds left, carefully stowed and treated with reverence usually reserved for religious artifacts. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for the first time in months, the men allowed themselves to believe they might actually survive them. Hope, fragile but persistent, had returned to the 37th Tank Battalion. 2 days later, the fog still lingered over the Lorraine countryside, clinging to the ground like a stubborn ghost. First Lieutenant Merwin Men stood in the turret of his Sherman, binoculars pressed to his eyes as he scanned the misty landscape. The initial victory had lifted the crew's spirits, but experience had taught him that war rarely offered simple solutions. "Panther, 2 o'clock, about 800 yards, Merwin called down, his voice tight. Through breaks in the fog, he could make out the distinctive silhouette, the sloped frontal armor that had become the stuff of nightmares for American tank crews. Sergeant Francis Baker nodded grimly, already reaching for one of the precious HVAP rounds. The crew fell silent, each man focused on his task with practiced precision. The loader slammed the shell into place with a metallic clank that echoed in the confined space. "Target identified," Baker murmured, his eye pressed to the sight. Adjusting for distance, Merwin watched through his periscope, heart hammering against his ribs. At this range, they were testing the limits of what these new rounds could do. The distance was far greater than their previous engagement. "Fire when ready," he ordered. The Sherman rocked as the gun roared. Through his sight, Merwin tracked the round's path toward the German tank. The HVAP struck the Panther's glacis plate at an angle and ricocheted, the round hissing harmlessly into the mist like a disappointed serpent. "No penetration," Baker reported, frustration evident in his voice. Round deflected off the upper glacis. A collective sigh passed through the crew. The Panther, now alerted to their presence, began to traverse its turret toward them. "Back up, now," Merwin commanded. The driver threw the Sherman into reverse, the tank lurching backward into thicker fog as the Panther fired, its shell whistling overhead. Later, huddled around a small fire near their tank, the crew's mood was subdued. The euphoria of their earlier success had given way to a more sobering reality. "So they're not magic bullets after all," the loader said, warming his hands over the flames. "Nothing ever is in this war," Merwin replied, his breath visible in the cold air. "But they're still the best chance we've got." Captain Kenneth Lamison approached their position, crouching down beside them. "I heard about what happened today." "The HVAP bounced right off, sir," Baker explained. "Too much distance, wrong angle." Lamison nodded thoughtfully. "So we learn. These rounds have limits. They need the right conditions to work." "Patience," Merwin added. "Precision and a fair bit of luck." The captain clapped him on the shoulder. "And getting closer than any sane man would want to be to a Panther." The men chuckled grimly. Their miracle weapon had shown its limitations, but in that knowledge lay a different kind of power. Understanding exactly how and when to use their advantage would make all the difference in the battles to come. Aim for the mantlet, not the glacis. Use the fog. Get close. The words spread through the ranks like wildfire, passed from tank to tank across the muddy fields of Lorraine. First Lieutenant Merwin Mann watched as his crew huddled around a small notebook. Sergeant Francis Baker sketching a crude diagram of a Panther's front armor. "See this angle here?" Baker tapped the paper with a grease-stained finger. "That's where we got him yesterday." The gunner had become something of a celebrity since their successful engagement. Other tank crews now sought him out during rest periods, hungry for any edge against the feared German tanks. In the mess tent that evening, Merwin found himself surrounded by commanders from other platoons, all asking the same questions. How close? What angle? How many rounds? He shared what they'd learned, watching as men scribbled notes on whatever they could find. Napkins, cigarette packs, even their palms. "The HVAP doesn't forgive bad positioning," he explained, stirring his lukewarm coffee. "You've got to get under 800 yards, or you're just wasting Detroit's miracle." Captain Kenneth Lamison observed these impromptu lessons from a distance. Though initially skeptical, he couldn't deny the change in his men's demeanor. Where once there had been resignation, now he saw determination. "They're building their own doctrine," he remarked to a fellow officer. "Pentagon might not approve, but it's keeping them alive." The informal playbook grew with each engagement. Tankers began marking successful firing positions on their maps, sharing them during rotation. Crews developed hand signals for when they spotted Panthers, a silent language that could mean the difference between life and death in the fog-shrouded battlefields. In foxholes and around campfires, veterans taught replacements how to identify the distinctive engine sound of the German tanks. "Sounds like a wounded bear," one sergeant explained to wide-eyed newcomers. "You'll hear it before you see it in this damn fog." Lieutenant Daniel Roebuck arrived with a fresh shipment of ammunition and found himself pulled into these gatherings. The supply officer listened intently, gathering stories to support his ongoing battle with the brass over HVAP production. "Keep those field notes coming," he told Merwin's crew. "I need every success story I can get." What struck Merwin most wasn't just the tactical knowledge being shared, but the bonds forming between crews who had once operated in isolation. Men who might never have spoken now saved seats for each other at meals, shared cigarettes, and promised to watch each other's flanks in the next engagement. "It's not just about killing Panthers anymore," Baker said quietly one night as they prepared for the next day's push. "It's about making sure we all get home." Merwin nodded, watching his men. Every scrap of knowledge, every lesson learned in blood and steel could save a life tomorrow. In the shared struggle against the Panthers, they'd found something perhaps even more valuable than tungsten core shells: brotherhood. The twisted metal carcass of the Panther lay half-submerged in mud, its crew long evacuated after an American shell had disabled but not destroyed the tank. A German repair team worked methodically in the drizzling rain, salvaging what they could from the damaged vehicle. "Herr Hauptmann, you should see this," called out a technician, his gloved hands carefully extracting something from the tank's interior. The object he held wasn't a standard component. It was an unexploded shell that had penetrated the armor but failed to detonate. Within hours, the peculiar round was transported to a command bunker, where General Hasso von Manteuffel examined it with growing concern. The general turned the shell in his hands, noting its distinctive silvery tip and unusual construction. This was no ordinary ammunition. "Tungsten core," he muttered, placing the shell carefully on his map table. "The Americans have been holding out on us. Intelligence reports had been filtering in for days. Accounts of Panthers destroyed at ranges where standard American shells should have bounced harmlessly off their armor. Von Manteuffel had initially dismissed these as exaggerations or lucky hits. The evidence before him suggested otherwise. How many of these rounds do they have?" he demanded of his intelligence officer. "Unknown, Herr General, but we've confirmed 3 Panther losses near Ericourt, where the armor was penetrated cleanly through the mantlet." The general's face darkened. The Panther had been Germany's answer to Allied armor superiority in numbers, a qualitative edge that had kept the balance. If the Americans could now defeat that advantage with new ammunition, word spread quickly among German tank crews. Drivers who had once advanced with confidence now hesitated at the edge of clearings. Commanders peered anxiously through their viewports, wondering if the next American Sherman they encountered might be carrying what troops had begun calling silver bullets. In a maintenance depot near the front, a Panther commander refused to take his repaired tank back to the line until additional armor plates were welded to the turret. Others demanded to move only at night. A mechanic was caught attempting to damage his own tank's transmission to avoid deployment. Von Manteuffel drafted urgent messages to Berlin, requesting information on the American M93 HVAP rounds and demanding countermeasures. His requests joined a growing pile of desperate appeals from the Western Front. "We must adapt," he told his staff officers that evening. "Adjust formations, change tactics. No Panther is to engage American tanks alone until we understand the full capabilities of this new threat." As darkness fell over Lorraine, the psychological impact of Baker's successful shots and the captured round rippled through German lines, an invisible wave of doubt eroding the foundation of their armored confidence. The myth of Panther invincibility was cracking, and both sides knew it. Dawn crept over the Lorraine countryside, the rising sun nothing but a pale smudge behind the impenetrable fog. First Lieutenant Merwin stood in the commander's hatch of his Sherman, straining to see more than 20 feet ahead. The dense mist muffled sound and obscured vision, perfect conditions for what they were about to attempt. Engines at quarter throttle, Merwin whispered into his radio. "Maintain formation by sound. Baker, HVAP loaded." Sergeant Francis Baker patted the specialized rounds secured beside him. "3 ready, Lieutenant. The rest stowed safely." The plan had come together during a midnight briefing in Captain Kenneth Lameson's makeshift command post. Intelligence reported 3 Panthers guarding the vital crossroads near Burrs, blocking the Allied advance. In clear weather, approaching would be suicide. But in this soup, they had a chance. "Remember," Merwin had told his crews, "we get close, under 400 yards, or we don't shoot at all." Now, 5 Shermans crawled through the fog like ghosts, their engines barely audible above the dripping moisture from the trees. The gunners kept their eyes pressed to periscopes, fingers tense on triggers. Every man's heart pounded against his ribs, sweat beating despite the morning chill. "Contact," came a hushed voice over the radio. "Panther silhouette, 10 o'clock. Merwin raised his binoculars. Through the swirling mist, he could just make out the distinctive angular shape of German armor. His mouth went dry. They were close. Dangerously close. "Hold position," he ordered. "Wait for my signal." The Sherman crews froze, suspended in terrifying limbo as they waited for the command. Through gaps in the fog, they could now see all three Panthers, their long barrels sweeping the mist like predators sensing prey. 300 yards, whispered the rangefinder. 290. Merwin took a deep breath. All tanks on my mark. Baker's hands were steady as he made final adjustments to his sight. The gunner had become something of a legend after his earlier successes, but he felt no pride, only the crushing responsibility of his comrades' lives resting on his aim. Fire! The Sherman's cannon roared, the muzzle flash briefly illuminating the fog. Baker's HVAP round streaked toward the first Panther, striking precisely where the turret met the hull. The German tank shuddered as flames erupted from its hatches. Before the enemy could respond, the other Shermans fired in sequence. 2 more HVAP rounds found their marks with devastating accuracy. Within 30 seconds, 3 Panthers burned in the morning mist, their crews scrambling to escape the infernos. "All tanks report," Merwin called, hardly believing what he was seeing. One by one, his platoon commanders confirmed. No casualties, no damage. They had achieved the impossible, a clean sweep. As the fog began to lift, revealing the smoking hulks of German armor, a cheer went up across the American radio net. For the first time, they weren't just surviving, they were winning. The rain had finally let up, but the roads to Luneville remained a churned mess of mud and tire tracks. First Lieutenant Merwin Men stood beside his Sherman, watching the approaching supply convoy with anticipation. It had been 7 days since their successful ambush near Birez, and morale among the men was higher than it had been in months. "Red Ball Express coming in hot," Sergeant Francis Baker called out, wiping grime from his hands. The gunner had been obsessively maintaining the tank's 76mm cannon, treating it with newfound respect since their string of Panther kills. The convoy's lead truck skidded to a halt, spraying mud across Merwin's boots. A harried supply sergeant jumped down, clipboard in hand. 37th Battalion, got your ordnance right here. Merwin signed for the crates, his heart sinking as he pried open the first one. Smoke rounds. The second contained high explosive shells. He dug through the entire shipment twice before accepting the truth. "No HVAP?" Baker asked, his voice tight. "Not a single round," Merwin confirmed. Captain Kenneth Lamison arrived minutes later, his face darkening as he surveyed the incorrect shipment. "I'll radio back to Nancy Depot. Lieutenant Roebuck might be able to redirect a shipment." But there wasn't time. Intelligence reported German armor moving toward their position by nightfall. "We'll make do," Merwin told his crew, though none of them believed it. The standard ammunition had proven nearly useless against Panther frontal armor. Without the tungsten core rounds, they were back to being outgunned and out-armored. 3 hours later, the attack came. 5 Panthers emerged from the tree line, advancing in a wedge formation. Merwin's platoon, positioned in hastily dug, hull-down positions, opened fire with their standard AP rounds. The shells bounced harmlessly off the German tank's sloped glacis plates. "Aim for the tracks," Merwin ordered over the radio, but the Panthers kept their distance, methodically picking off 2 Shermans with devastating accuracy. Baker loaded and fired with mechanical precision, but frustration etched deeper lines into his face with each ineffective hit. When a Panther round struck the Sherman to their right, the tank erupted into flames. Private Wilson, the youngest member of that crew, didn't make it out. By dusk, Merwin's platoon had lost 3 tanks and 7 men. They retreated to a defensive position outside the village, the surviving crews shell-shocked and silent. "We got too confident," Lamison said later that night, his voice barely audible over the distant artillery. One miracle weapon doesn't win a war. The captain looked exhausted, the weight of the day's losses evident in the slump of his shoulders. Supply chains break. Plans fail. We need to be ready for that. Merwin nodded, watching his men huddled around small fires. The brief flame of hope that had burned so brightly after their first victories now guttered in the wind. The myth of Panther invincibility, momentarily shattered, had reasserted itself with brutal efficiency. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the fields near Paroy Forest a churning mess of mud and tire tracks. Sergeant Francis Baker squinted through the gunner's sight of their Sherman, his fingers tapping nervously against the firing mechanism. First Lieutenant Merwin Men stood behind him, hand resting on Baker's shoulder. 800 yards, Francis. Wait for my mark, Merwin whispered, his voice steady despite the tension that gripped the entire crew. Through the scope, Baker could see the Panther tank moving confidently across the open field, its commander apparently unaware of their presence. The German vehicle's silhouette was unmistakable. The sloped armor that had been the death of so many American tanks now presented itself as a perfect target. "Remember what we learned," the lieutenant reminded him. "Hit the turret junction, just like we discussed." Baker nodded, making minute adjustments to his aim. He had already loaded one of their precious HVAP rounds, the silvery tip catching what little sunlight filtered through the clouds. The entire crew held their breath. "Now," Merwin ordered. The Sherman rocked with the recoil as Baker fired. The round streaked across the battlefield, a perfect arc that connected with the Panther's turret exactly where the armor joined the hull. What happened next would be described dozens of times in mess tents across the division. The German tank's turret split open like a cracked egg, flames erupting skyward in a spectacular column. Secondary explosions followed as ammunition cooked off inside. Not a single crew member escaped. "Holy hell," whispered the loader, eyes wide with disbelief. Captain Kenneth Lamison arrived at their position an hour later, binoculars trained on the still smoldering wreckage. "That's the cleanest kill I've seen in months," he admitted, the usual skepticism in his voice replaced with genuine admiration. By nightfall, word had spread throughout the battalion. Tank crews gathered around fires, passing canteens and retelling what was already being called Baker's bullet. The gunner found himself surrounded by men asking for details, hanging on his every word as he explained the shot. "It's all about the angle," Baker explained modestly, "and having a commander who knows when to wait." Lieutenant Daniel Roebuck arrived 2 days later with a fresh shipment of supplies. "Heard about your shot all the way back at the depot," he told Baker, slapping him on the back. "They're talking about it up and down the line." For the first time since facing the Panthers, American tankers walked with shoulders straight, exchanging confident nods instead of grim acknowledgments. Meanwhile, intercepted German communications revealed growing fear among Panther crews, who now hesitated to advance when Sherman tanks were reported nearby. The balance had shifted. As Merwin watched his men prepare for the next day's advance, he realized something fundamental had changed. The myth of German invincibility had been shattered, not just by technology, but by the skill and courage of men like Baker. Captain Kenneth Lamison leaned against the wooden table in the farmhouse command post, studying the reports from the latest interrogations. 3 German tank commanders, captured near Luneville, had independently confirmed what American intelligence had suspected. The Panthers were losing their psychological edge. "They speak of American tanks firing silver bullets," the intelligence officer explained, sliding forward a translated transcript. One POW claims his commander refused to advance without at least 3-to-1 numerical advantage. Kenneth nodded, his weathered face betraying a hint of satisfaction. Just 2 months earlier, a single Panther could send an entire Sherman company scrambling for cover. Now the tables were turning. Outside, the October rain drummed steadily against the tin roof. First Lieutenant Merwin Men entered, mud caking his boots, bringing news from the front lines. "Sir, we're hearing strange things from the locals," Merwin reported. Apparently, some German tank crews are deliberately sabotaging their own vehicles. Sabotage? The captain straightened. Yes, sir. A French mechanic who worked in a German repair depot claims he witnessed a crew sergeant pouring sand into a Panther's gearbox. Another report mentions loosened mantlet bolts. These weren't isolated incidents. Throughout the Lorraine region, Panther companies were showing unprecedented hesitation. General Hasso von Manteuffel had reportedly issued harsh directives against cowardice, but the psychological damage was done. Baker's shot has become something of a legend, Merwin continued, referring to his gunner's famous kill. The Germans have their own version of it now. They call our HVAP rounds ghost shells, say they pass through armor like spirits. Kenneth smiled grimly. Fear is a powerful weapon, Lieutenant. Later that evening, Sergeant Francis Baker sat with his fellow gunners in a muddy foxhole, sharing cigarettes and field techniques. Aim for the right side of the mantlet, he explained, sketching in the dirt with a stick. That's where the welds are weakest. The men listened intently. Baker had become something of a celebrity among the tank battalions. The man who proved Panthers could bleed. Back at headquarters, Lieutenant Daniel Roebuck finally received confirmation. HVAP production was being prioritized at the Colorado Ordnance Depot. His persistent advocacy had paid off. We're shipping 3 times the previous allocation, he told Kenneth over the field telephone. Your tankers will have what they need. The captain ended the call and stepped outside, watching American Shermans rumbling toward the front. For months, these tanks had been called Ronson lighters or death traps when facing Panthers. Now, equipped with knowledge, tactics, and those precious HVAP rounds, they moved with newfound confidence. The myth of Panther invincibility hadn't just cracked, it had shattered completely. Lieutenant Daniel Roebuck slammed his fist on the makeshift desk, sending requisition forms flying. The depot near Nancy had become his personal battleground, one where the weapons weren't rifles and tanks, but paperwork and persuasion. These numbers don't lie, Major, Daniel insisted, pointing to the field reports spread before a stern-faced officer. The HVAP rounds are making a difference. We need more and fast. The Major adjusted his glasses, unimpressed. There's no conclusive proof a handful of shells are worth diverting resources from established production lines. The Rocky Mountain Arsenal has quotas to meet. Daniel had been fighting this battle for weeks. Each morning, he'd arrive at the supply depot with fresh reports. Each afternoon, he'd leave with nothing but vague promises and bureaucratic excuses. The tungsten cores for HVAP rounds were in short supply, and convincing command to prioritize their production felt impossible. Sir, with respect, our boys are dying out there, the supply officer argued, his voice dropping. These rounds give them a fighting chance against those Panthers. A colonel passing through the office paused, interest peaked. You talking about those special shells? The ones they're calling silver bullets in the field reports? Daniel nodded eagerly. Yes, sir. Sergeant Baker from the 37th Tank Battalion took out 3 Panthers in one engagement. The men are calling it Baker's Miracle. The colonel rubbed his chin thoughtfully. I've heard those stories. Thought they were just tall tales to boost morale. They're real, sir, Daniel insisted, pulling out a photograph of a destroyed Panther. This was taken after Baker's shot, clean penetration through the mantlet, something our standard ammunition can't accomplish. The supply chain was frustratingly complex. Tungsten came from mines in China and Bolivia, was processed in facilities back home, then shipped across the Atlantic. Every step required approvals, priorities, signatures. That evening, Daniel sat alone in the mess tent, picking at cold beans while drafting yet another request. A radio operator approached, handing him a telegram. Just came through, sir. Thought you'd want to see it immediately. The message was brief. Field reports from Captain Lamison's battalion confirmed 5 Panther kills using HVAP rounds in the past week. The evidence was mounting. 3 days later, Daniel stood in the rain as trucks from the Red Ball Express unloaded crates marked priority. He pried one open, revealing rows of M93 HVAP rounds, their distinctive silver tips gleaming even in the dreary weather. An accompanying order authorized redirecting 15% of tungsten allocation to HVAP production. It wasn't everything he'd asked for, but it was a start. The supply officer smiled as he signed the receipt. Baker's legend and Merwin's tactical reports had finally penetrated the wall of skepticism. Now he just needed to get these rounds to the front before the next German offensive. Stacking HVAP at the front of the ready rack, First Lieutenant Merwin Men instructed his loader, pointing to the ammunition storage. Regular AP behind it. We need to be ready to switch fast. The lessons of the past weeks had crystallized into a new doctrine among the Sherman crews. What had begun as desperate improvisation was evolving into calculated strategy. Merwin gathered his platoon behind their vehicles, sketching maneuvers in the mud with a broken branch. Panthers have better range and penetration, he explained, so we don't fight their fight. We harass with standard rounds from distance, make them think we're ineffective, then close in under cover for the kill shot. Francis Baker nodded, his gunner's eyes narrowed in concentration. The man whose perfect shot had become legend throughout the battalion understood better than most the importance of timing and angle. 800 yards is our magic number, Baker added, addressing the newer replacements. Beyond that, save the silver bullets. Inside that, aim for the mantlet or turret ring. Captain Kenneth Lamison observed from a distance, arms crossed. The transformation in his men was remarkable. Where once they'd cowered at Panther sightings, now they discussed tactics with calculated precision. He wouldn't admit it openly, but Lamison had started diverting additional HVAP shipments to his battalion whenever possible. Terrain is our ally, Merwin continued, pointing toward a nearby hedgerow. We drill flanking maneuvers today. 2 tanks provide distraction fire while the 3rd circles under cover. Communication is everything. The afternoon saw Sherman engines growling through practice runs, crews timing their movements with increasing confidence. They practiced exploiting every fold in the landscape, every patch of fog, every hedgerow and ditch that might conceal their approach. Lieutenant Daniel Roebuck arrived with a small shipment of ammunition, watching the drills with approval. Ordnance is finally taking notice, he told Merwin during a break. Your success reports are changing minds back at supply. What neither man voiced was the intelligence coming through command channels. German tank crews were growing increasingly desperate. Prisoners spoke of Panthers refusing to advance without infantry support, of commanders relieved for showing caution, of crews sabotaging their own vehicles to avoid combat. They're changing tactics too, Lamison warned his officers that evening. Keeping distance, using terrain better. This advantage won't last forever. Merwin nodded, studying the map of their next objective. The psychological edge might be temporary, but it was real. His men no longer saw themselves as sacrificial pawns against superior German armor. They had become hunters. Tomorrow we move on the crossroads, he announced. Standard formation, but be ready to adapt. The enemy knows we can hurt them now. Baker cleaned his gun sight with methodical precision. Let them know, he said quietly. Makes them hesitate. And hesitation gets them killed. The captured Panther sat like a wounded beast in the muddy field outside Lunéville, its left track blown clean off and a gaping hole in its side armor. American engineers from the 4th Armored Division swarmed around it, measuring, photographing, and documenting every inch of the German tank that had terrorized Allied forces for months. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Hayworth, head of the technical assessment team, waved First Lieutenant Merwin Men over. Take a look at this, Lieutenant, he said, pointing to the turret roof. Merwin climbed atop the massive vehicle, careful to avoid the jagged edges of the damaged armor. See this weld seam? Hayworth traced his finger along a line where 2 armor plates joined. Your gunner's famous shot hit right here. The manufacturing quality isn't what German propaganda claims. Merwin studied the seam carefully. Baker's legendary shot hadn't been just luck after all. The weld created a structural weakness in the otherwise formidable armor. a vulnerability that only appeared when the turret was rotated to certain positions. "How consistent is this flaw?" Merwin asked, thinking of his crew waiting back at camp. "Consistent enough to exploit," replied the engineer. "But you'd need perfect timing and positioning. The tank would need to be engaged from the 3 o'clock position while its turret is traversing toward you." That evening, Merwin gathered his platoon around a crude diagram drawn in the dirt. Sergeant Francis Baker knelt beside him, eyes fixed on the illustration. "Gentlemen, we found their Achilles heel," Merwin announced. "That shot Baker made wasn't just good fortune. The Panthers have a vulnerability, a weak weld seam in the turret roof." The men exchanged glances, hope mingling with skepticism. "The catch is," Merwin continued, "you'll need to get the Panther to rotate its turret while you're positioned at its flank. Then hit it precisely at this point with an HVAP round." Baker nodded slowly, split-second timing, and we'd have to bait them into turning. Captain Kenneth Lamison, who had quietly joined the gathering, spoke up. "It's a high-risk maneuver. You'd be exposing yourselves deliberately." "But it works," Baker insisted. "We've proven it works." The next morning, Merwin's crew practiced the new tactic using disabled vehicles as stand-ins. They worked out a method. One Sherman would draw the Panther's attention from the front, while another would creep to the flank position. As the German tank rotated to engage the new threat, the gunner would have a 3-second window to hit the vulnerable seam. Word spread through the battalion. Tank commanders huddled over diagrams, memorizing angles and timing. The knowledge transformed their approach. No longer would they flee at the sight of Panthers. Now they hunted them. "It's still dangerous as hell," Merwin reminded his men. "But at least now we know they can bleed." Captain Kenneth Lamison stared at the inventory sheet, then at the wooden crate hidden beneath canvas in his tent. The decision he'd made 3 days ago still gnawed at him. Headquarters had ordered all HVAP rounds to be evenly distributed across 4 battalions, but he'd quietly redirected 2 shipments exclusively to his own men. "Sir, Colonel Abrams is on the radio," his aide announced, poking his head through the tent flap. The captain rubbed his temples. "Tell him I'm reviewing deployment strategies." In truth, he was calculating how many Panthers his tankers might face in the coming offensive. Intelligence suggested at least 2 companies of German armor waiting across the valley. Without those special rounds, his men would be lambs to slaughter. Merwin men had proven what these shells could do. The young lieutenant's crew had taken out 7 Panthers in the past month, transforming from hunted to hunters. But it wasn't just Baker's legendary marksmanship that made the difference. It was having the right ammunition at the right moment. "Damn the paperwork," Lamison muttered, signing off on a falsified report that claimed a supply truck had been hit by artillery. The missing HVAP rounds would be written off as destroyed. That evening, he gathered his tank commanders in the abandoned schoolhouse, serving as their temporary headquarters. Maps covered the walls, marked with known German positions. "Each Sherman gets 4 HVAP rounds," he announced, ignoring the surprised murmurs. "Use them only when you have a clear shot at under 600 yards. Save them for Panthers, nothing else." First Lieutenant Men raised an eyebrow but said nothing. He understood what his commander had done. The offensive began at dawn 2 days later. As predicted, Panthers waited in ambush positions across the rolling hills. But Lamison's crews were prepared. Following Merwin's tactics, they used terrain for cover, maneuvering for those critical close-range shots where HVAP rounds could penetrate. By midday, 8 German tanks lay burning across the battlefield. The battalion had lost only 3 Shermans, a miracle by any standard. When the radio crackled with Colonel Abrams demanding to know how they'd managed such success, Lamison kept his explanation vague. "Good men, good tactics, sir. The victory came at a personal cost." A week later, Lamison stood at attention before the division commander, facing questions about irregularities in ammunition distribution. "Your actions bordered on insubordination, Captain," the general said coldly. "Yes, sir," Lamison replied, his face impassive. "But my battalion suffered 27% fewer casualties than the others." The general's jaw tightened. "No formal charges were filed, but Lamison knew his promotion prospects had dimmed considerably. Walking back to his quarters, he passed Merwin's Sherman being resupplied. The lieutenant gave him a knowing nod. Both men understood that some decisions transcended the chain of command. Some choices were about bringing men home alive. December arrived with a vengeance. The skies over Lorraine, once filled with the reassuring drone of Allied aircraft, fell silent under thick blankets of snow clouds. First Lieutenant Merwin Men stood atop his Sherman, scanning the white landscape that stretched before him like a blank canvas, waiting for the crimson signature of battle. "No flyboys today," Merwin muttered, brushing accumulated snow from his binoculars. "Or tomorrow, or the day after." The weather had turned against them with cruel timing. Just as the American tankers had begun to master their dance with the Panthers, nature had changed the rules. Without air support, every encounter became a primitive duel, steel against steel, wit against wit. Sergeant Francis Baker huddled inside the tank, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "How many rounds we got left?" he asked, though he knew the answer. The gunner had counted their precious HVAP shells hourly, like a miser tallying coins. "5," replied Merwin, dropping back into the turret. "5 chances to get it right." The white silence of the Ardennes pressed against them, broken only by the occasional crack of distant artillery. Snow muffled everything. Engine sounds, track movements, even radio transmissions came through with ghostly static. Perfect hunting conditions for Panthers, whose commanders had learned to exploit the weather. Captain Kenneth Lamison's orders had been clear during their last briefing in a half-collapsed barn. Conserve fuel, conserve ammunition. Most importantly, conserve yourselves. The captain's face had shown the strain of recent weeks, the victories, the losses. The constant battle with supply lines stretched thin across war-torn France. At midday, the radio crackled. "Contact, Grid 47, 3 Panthers moving south toward Neufchâteau." Merwin's crew moved with practiced efficiency. No wasted motion, no unnecessary words. The lieutenant guided their Sherman through a narrow ravine, using the terrain to mask their approach. The snow, both blessing and curse, concealed their movements while threatening to bog them down at any moment. "Remember," Merwin said quietly as they positioned themselves behind a ridge, "we wait for the shot. Perfect angle, perfect distance. No heroics." Baker nodded, fingers flexing inside his gloves. His reputation had spread beyond their battalion, the gunner who could split a Panther seam. But reputation wouldn't help if ice froze the turret mechanism or snow obscured their vision at the critical moment. Through his viewport, Merwin watched the German tanks advance through the white landscape. Their dark silhouettes moved with predatory confidence, unaware of the Sherman waiting in ambush. Every instinct screamed to fire early, to eliminate the threat before it could strike. But patience had become their greatest weapon. In the pristine silence of winter, with resources dwindling, and each HVAP round worth its weight in gold, Merwin's tactical discipline would determine whether they lived to see spring. "Hold," he whispered, though no one had moved. "Wait for my command." In the white silence of the Ardennes, time itself seemed frozen. Every shot counted. Every mistake was fatal. Word spread through the ranks like wildfire. The Germans had adapted. First Lieutenant Merwin Men heard it first from a reconnaissance patrol that had barely escaped with their lives outside Bastogne. The Panthers were changing. "Thicker mantlets," whispered a soldier from the Third Army. "Heard they're adding extra plates, angled differently." Merwin's crew exchanged worried glances around their Sherman. The bitter December cold had settled into their bones, making every movement stiff and deliberate. Sergeant Francis Baker cleaned his gun sight for the 3rd time that morning, his face tight with concentration. "If they've reinforced the mantlets, Our advantage is slipping, Merwin said, studying a crude sketch another tank commander had passed along. They've been collecting our duds, studying them. The skirmish began without warning. 3 Panthers emerged from the tree line east of their position, moving with unexpected confidence. Captain Kenneth Lamison's voice crackled over the radio, ordering a controlled withdrawal to better ground. "Not yet," Merwin told his driver. "Baker, load HVAP." The gunner slid one of their precious rounds into the breech. "Ready, sir." The lead Panther halted at 800 yards. Too far for optimal HVAP performance, but close enough that they'd succeeded before. Baker took careful aim at the mantlet, adjusting for the slight crosswind. "Fire!" The Sherman rocked with the recoil. Through his binoculars, Merwin watched the round strike and glance off with a shower of sparks. The Panther's turret swiveled toward them, unharmed. "Back up, now," Merwin ordered. They retreated behind a ridge just as the German shells screamed overhead. The crew sat in stunned silence, the reality sinking in. Their silver bullets weren't magic anymore. Later, at the command post, Lamison gathered his officers. "Intelligence confirms it," he said grimly. "They've modified at least 30% of their Panthers with reinforced mantlets. The race is on." Lieutenant Daniel Roebuck, who'd arrived with the latest ammunition shipment, shook his head. "We're already working on improved penetrators back home, but production takes time." "Time we don't have," Merwin replied. That night, Baker approached Merwin with a worn notebook. "Been studying our successful hits," he said. "The mantlet's tougher, but what about here?" He pointed to a junction where the turret met the hull. "If we can get a side angle, maybe 30 degrees, Merwin nodded slowly. "We adapt too." Word went out through the battalion. New aim points, new tactics. The Germans had countered, but American ingenuity wouldn't be stopped. As Merwin watched his men prepare for tomorrow's engagement, he knew the psychological edge remained theirs. The Panthers were no longer invincible. They were simply the next problem to solve. The war of armor versus shell continued, each side learning, adapting, and evolving with every encounter. The German officer sat shivering in the corner of the farmhouse, his once pristine uniform now mud-stained and torn. Captain Kenneth Lamison circled him like a hawk, skepticism etched across his weathered face. The defector had arrived just before dawn, clutching a leather case containing detailed maps of Panther deployments throughout eastern Lorraine. "This could be an elaborate trap," Lamison muttered, spreading the documents across the makeshift table. The Germans aren't exactly known for their honesty these days. First Lieutenant Merwin Menn studied the maps silently. Something about the officer's demeanor struck him. The hollow gaze, the slight tremor in his hands that couldn't be faked. This wasn't the face of deception, but of a man who had seen too much. "Sir, I think he's legitimate," Merwin finally said. "Look at these deployment patterns. They match exactly what we've been encountering." The captain rubbed his stubbled chin. "Even if it's real, this intelligence will be worthless in 48 hours. They'll realize he's gone and change everything." Sergeant Francis Baker joined them, his eyes darting between the maps and the German. "Then we move now while we still have the advantage." The defector spoke in halting English, pointing to a crossroads marked in red. "3 Panthers, waiting in ambush. They expect your advance from the west." Lamison ordered the German taken to division headquarters for further questioning, but not before Merwin memorized every detail of those maps. Something about the specific positioning of those tanks nagged at him. It was perfect for an ambush, but equally vulnerable if approached from an unexpected angle. That evening, Merwin gathered his platoon. "We have a small window," he explained, sketching the terrain in the dirt. "If this intelligence is accurate, we can catch them completely off guard." Baker checked their ammunition stores. 4 HVAP rounds total. "Enough if we're precise." Some of the men exchanged worried glances. "What if it's a setup?" one asked. Merwin looked each man in the eye. "I saw something in that officer's face. He's done with this war, same as us." He paused. but we'll approach with caution. Second platoon will provide cover from the ridge while we flank through the ravine." The commander knew he was staking everything on his instinct. If wrong, his entire platoon could be decimated. If right, they might eliminate 3 Panthers without losing a single Sherman. As they prepared to move out under cover of darkness, Lamison approached. "This better work, Merwin. I'm sticking my neck out approving this." "It will," Merwin replied, though uncertainty gnawed at him. The tanks rumbled to life, their crews tense but ready. Whatever awaited them at that crossroads, they would face it together, with skill, with courage, and with 6 rounds that had changed everything. Snow fell in thick, heavy flakes as First Lieutenant Merwin Men squinted through the periscope of his battered Sherman. The crossroads outside Montmedy had become their last stand, a strategic position they couldn't surrender during the chaos of the Bulge. His tank sat partially concealed behind the remains of a stone wall, the engine idling on fumes. "Fuel gauge is kissing empty, sir," whispered Corporal Wilson from the driver's seat, his breath visible in the freezing air. Merwin nodded grimly. The situation was dire. 3 days of constant fighting had left their Shermans scarred and limping. Worse, they had just 1 HVAP round remaining, their last silver bullet. "Movement at 2 o'clock, Sergeant Francis Baker called out, his voice steady despite the circumstances. The gunner hadn't slept in 36 hours, yet his hands remained rock steady on the controls. Through breaks in the swirling snow, Merwin spotted them, 3 Panther tanks advancing in a staggered formation toward the crossroads. If they secured this position, Captain Lamison's entire company would be cut off from retreat. "Radio's dead," reported Private Jenkins, their radio man. "We're on our own." Merwin weighed their options. They could retreat, abandoning the crucial intersection, or make a stand with almost no chance of survival. The memory of Lamison's last orders echoed in his mind. "Hold that crossroads at all costs." "Load the HVAP," Merwin ordered, his voice betraying no hesitation. "We've got 1 shot to make this count." Baker nodded, carefully handling their final tungsten core round. "Which one, Lieutenant?" Merwin studied the approaching Panthers. The lead tank was moving faster, more confidently than the others. "The first one, but not yet. We need the perfect angle." The crew fell silent as the Panthers drew closer. 200 yards, 150. The lead Panther began to turn, exposing a section of turret roof at precisely the angle the engineers had identified as vulnerable. "Now, Baker," Merwin whispered, "remember the weld seam." The gunner took a deep breath, adjusting his aim by mere millimeters. "On target. Fire." The Sherman rocked as the 76mm gun roared. Through his periscope, Merwin watched their last hope streak across the snow-filled air. For one terrible moment, nothing happened. Then, with a catastrophic crack, the Panther's turret split open. Flames erupted from the German tank, illuminating the snowfall in eerie orange light. The burning Panther blocked the narrow road completely. The other 2 tanks halted, unable to maneuver around their destroyed comrade in the confined space. "Back us up," Merwin ordered. "Slowly." As they withdrew into the protection of nearby woods, Baker allowed himself a small smile. "1 shot," he said quietly. Merwin nodded, watching the roadblock they'd created. It wouldn't hold forever, but it would buy Captain Lamison's company the precious hours they needed to regroup. "Sometimes," the lieutenant replied, "1 shot is all you need." The last day of 1944 brought a pale winter sun over the Ardennes. First Lieutenant Merwin Men stood atop his battered Sherman, surveying the aftermath of yesterday's desperate stand at the Montmedy crossroads. 3 German Panthers lay in ruins, one still smoldering, its ammunition cooking off with occasional pops that made the newer replacements flinch. "Never thought we'd see this day," Francis Baker said, climbing up beside him. The gunner's face was streaked with soot, his eyes bloodshot from days without proper sleep, but there was something different in his expression now. Pride, perhaps, or simple relief. Merwin nodded, running his gloved hand along a fresh gash in their tank's turret where a Panther round had nearly ended them all. 6 months ago, we were running from these beasts. The rest of the crew emerged from their makeshift shelter, exhausted men gathering around their vehicle like it was a campfire. They'd named her Second Chance after their first Sherman had been destroyed outside Aracourt. The name felt prophetic now. Captain Kenneth Lamison arrived in a mud-splattered jeep, boots crunching through the frozen ground as he approached. "Headquarters is calling your crossroads stand miraculous," he announced, the ghost of a smile playing at his lips. Though I suspect it had more to do with that last HVAP round than divine intervention. The men laughed, a sound that would have been unthinkable months earlier when facing Panthers meant certain death. "The Germans are pulling back," Lamison continued. "Intelligence says they're regrouping east of here, but something's changed. Their tank commanders are hesitating, second-guessing. The mystique is gone." A supply truck rumbled up the road, and Lieutenant Daniel Roebuck jumped down from the passenger seat. The supply officer carried a wooden crate toward them, his face split with a grin wider than the scene. "Christmas comes late, gentlemen," he called, dropping the crate at Merwin's feet. Inside lay 24 HVAP rounds, their silver tips gleaming in the winter light. Detroit finally convinced the brass. Full production run. The crew gathered around, touching the shells with something approaching reverence. These weren't just ammunition, they represented survival. As the men dispersed to resupply and repair, Merwin remained by his tank, watching the last wisps of morning fog dissipate from the valley below. The war was far from over. The enemy would adapt, as they always did. The Panthers would return with reinforced mantlets and new tactics. But for the first time since landing on European soil, American tankers faced the German beasts as equals. The playing field had leveled. The myth of Panther invincibility had evaporated like the morning fog. They had a fighting chance now. And sometimes, Merwin thought as he climbed back into his Sherman, that was enough to win a war.